What happens when a ruthless gang targets the wrong black business owner, thinking his quiet demeanor makes him an easy mark, only to find out that he is ex-Special Forces? Watch as he fights back against the gang and uncovers a shocking secret that has contributed to the deliberate targeting of black communities. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet streets of Brandon Carter's neighborhood, where resilience hummed beneath the surface of every cracked sidewalk and faded storefront sign. His convenience store, Carter's Market, stood on the corner of 5th and Maple, its shelves neatly stocked with essentials that served the tight-knit community. Behind the counter, Brandon adjusted a security camera monitor, his sharp eyes scanning the feed out of habit. Brandon wasn't just a store owner. His military career was behind him now, but the instincts he'd honed as a Special Forces operative never faded. Every inch of the store reflected his precision: the placement of goods, the reinforced locks, the alarm system wired into every vulnerable corner. This was more than a store to him. It was a lifeline for the people who lived here, a place where neighbors came not just for groceries, but for safety and familiarity in a rapidly changing neighborhood. He leaned on the counter, watching the evening crowd pass by outside. A young mother wrangled her toddler, an older man shuffled along with a cane, and teenagers laughed as they disappeared around the corner. It was a rhythm he loved, one that reminded him why he stayed, even when the world outside seemed to encroach on everything his community had built. The bell above the door chimed as a regular customer walked in, nodding to Brandon before heading to the back for a carton of milk. Brandon offered a quick smile, but his thoughts wandered. He'd heard murmurs lately, rumors of intimidation, of businesses like his being strong-armed into selling to shady developers. He hadn't seen anything firsthand, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The evening stretched on, and the crowd thinned. Brandon locked the front door briefly to count the cash register, letting the quiet settle in. He didn't know that, just a block away, 3 men were parked in an old pickup truck, their crude laughter masking their darker intent. When Brandon reopened the door, the first man to step inside had a swagger to his walk, his eyes scanning the shelves with a mix of disdain and greed. The other 2 followed, their presence heavy with unspoken threats. Brandon's hand hovered near the counter, his senses sharpening. He wasn't just watching customers anymore. He was preparing for a storm. The leader, Gary, leaned on the counter, his sharp eyes studying Brandon like a hawk circling prey. "Nice place you got here," he said with a smirk, tapping his fingers against the surface. "Real nice. Looks like you do good business." Brandon didn't respond right away. He let the man's words hang in the air, his gaze calm but unyielding. "We get by," he said evenly, his voice devoid of the nervousness Gary was likely expecting. The stocky man, Todd, wandered down an aisle, his boots scuffing against the floor. He picked up a box of cereal, turning it over in his hands like he was inspecting it, before tossing it back on the shelf with a loud clatter. "That business could be better, though," he said, his voice carrying over the shelves. "You know, with the right kind of help." Brandon didn't take his eyes off Gary, but he kept track of Todd's movements in his peripheral vision. "We don't need any help," he said simply. Gary let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's the thing about people like you. Always so proud. Think you can do it all yourself. But let me tell you something, old man. Pride's expensive, and from where I'm standing it looks like you can't afford it." "Is that so?" Brandon replied, his tone steady. Mike, the lanky man near the door, let out a nervous chuckle. "Man, Gary, this guy's got balls. I'll give him that. Standing there all calm like we're just here to buy groceries." Gary shot Mike a look that shut him up, then leaned in closer to Brandon. "We're not asking for much," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Just a little cut, you know? A small fee to make sure nothing happens to this nice little store of yours." Brandon straightened, his expression hardening. "Nothing's going to happen to my store," he said firmly. Gary's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, before he covered it with a laugh. "You hear that, boys? He thinks he's untouchable." He turned to Todd, who had moved closer to the register, and motioned toward the shelves. "Why don't you show him what happens to guys who don't want to play ball?" Todd grabbed a jar of sauce from a shelf and held it up, pretending to examine it. "This stuff's expensive," he said, feigning curiosity. "Think it'll break if I drop it?" Brandon's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. "You can leave now," he said, his voice low and steady. Gary raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Leave? We just got here. And besides, we're not done talking yet." He gestured to Todd, who grinned and hurled the jar onto the floor. It shattered with a loud crash, the dark red sauce splattering across the tiles. The sound seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Brandon didn't move, his eyes locked on Gary's. "You're cleaning that up," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Todd laughed, his boots crunching over the broken glass as he took a step forward. "Oh, I don't think so, old man. But you can clean it up. Isn't that what you're here for?" Mike shifted uncomfortably by the door, his eyes darting between his companions and Brandon. "Hey, maybe we should chill out, yeah? This guy doesn't look like he's gonna roll over." "Shut up, Mike," Gary snapped, his eyes narrowing at Brandon. "This guy needs to learn how things work around here. We're doing him a favor, and he's spitting in our faces." Brandon tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "This isn't how things work around here," he said, "and you're not doing me any favors. All you're doing is making a mess you're going to regret." Gary leaned back, his hands resting on his hips as he let out a humorless laugh. "You hear that? This guy thinks he's got options. Let me tell you something, old man. You don't. Not with us. Not with what's coming." "What's coming?" Brandon asked, his voice sharp with curiosity. Todd stepped closer, crossing his arms as he loomed over the counter. "You'll find out soon enough. Unless, of course, you want to make this easy. Sell the store now. We know people who'd love to take it off your hands." Brandon looked at the men, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not selling. Not today. Not ever." Gary's smirk returned, but it was tinged with frustration. "You're gonna wish you did," he said. "We'll be back, old man, and when we come back, we're not gonna ask nicely." Brandon's voice dropped to a deadly calm. "You've already made a mistake coming here. If you come back, it'll be your last." The weight of his words hung in the air, silencing even Todd. For a moment, it seemed like Gary might push further, but instead, he motioned to his crew. "Let's go," he said curtly. The three men headed for the door, their departure slow and deliberate, as if daring Brandon to stop them. When the door finally shut behind them, Brandon allowed himself a deep breath. The storm hadn't struck yet, but he could feel it brewing on the horizon. The next day started like any other. Brandon opened the store early, his routine as precise as ever. But under the surface, tension simmered. He had spent the night preparing, not just the store, but himself. He double-checked the locks and cameras before turning the sign to open. His movements were calm, but his thoughts were sharp. He knew they'd come back. Men like that never walked away after being challenged. It wasn't long before his instincts were proven right. Around midday, the low rumble of an engine announced their arrival. Brandon glanced at the security monitor and saw the same battered pickup truck pulling up to the curb. Gary hopped out first, his swagger even more exaggerated than the day before. Todd followed, cracking his knuckles, while Mike trailed behind, his smirk as cocky as the others. The bell above the door chimed, and the air in the store shifted. A few customers paused mid-step, their eyes darting to the trio. Brandon stepped out from behind the counter, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. "Back so soon?" Brandon asked, his tone even. Gary grinned, spreading his arms as he sauntered toward the counter. "What can I say? We missed you." Brandon didn't reply, his eyes flicking briefly to Todd, who had already started wandering toward the shelves. "We figured maybe you'd had time to reconsider," Gary continued, leaning on the counter. "You know, about our little arrangement." Brandon folded his arms, his stance solid. "Not interested." Todd let out a sharp laugh, tossing a can of soup into the air and catching it. "That's cute. You think this is a negotiation?" Brandon's gaze shifted to Todd, then back to Gary. "I think it's time for you to leave." Gary's grin faded, replaced by a hard edge. You've got a smart mouth, old man, but I'm not leaving until you understand how things work around here. Gary motioned to Todd, who knocked over a rack of snacks with a sweep of his arm. Bags and boxes clattered to the floor, the noise loud enough to make a couple of customers flinch. "This store's got some real nice stuff," Todd said, smirking. "Be a shame if anything happened to it." Brandon stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Pick it up." Todd raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Or what?" "Or you'll find out," Brandon said, his tone razor-sharp. Gary's laughter broke the tension. "Oh, I like this guy. Got some fire in him. Too bad it's gonna get him burned." He gestured toward the door. "Customers, get out. Private business meeting happening here." A few of the remaining shoppers hesitated, glancing nervously at Brandon. He gave them a curt nod, silently telling them it was okay to leave. One by one, they shuffled out, casting worried glances over their shoulders. The bell jingled as the last customer exited, leaving the store heavy with silence. Gary leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Now that we've got the place to ourselves, let me make this real simple. You're gonna pay up, or things are gonna get real messy." Todd cracked his knuckles, grinning. "Real messy." Brandon didn't flinch. "You're not getting a cent out of me, and if you're smart, you'll walk out that door before this gets worse for you." Mike snorted, leaning against a shelf. "Worse for us? That's rich. You're outnumbered, old man." Gary slammed his hand on the counter, making the cash register rattle. "You think you're tough, huh? You think you're untouchable? You're nothing. Just another punk with a store we're gonna own by the end of the week." Brandon's gaze was ice cold. "Try it. See how far you get." The quiet threat in his voice made Todd's grin falter for a moment, but Gary stepped in, his bravado unshaken. He turned to Todd and Mike. "Break something. Let him know we're serious." Todd didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed a jar from the nearest shelf and hurled it to the floor, the glass shattering in an explosion of sauce. He kicked over another shelf for good measure, sending cans and boxes spilling everywhere. Mike joined in, knocking over a display stand with a loud crash. The noise echoed through the store, but Brandon stayed rooted, his eyes locked on Gary. "That's enough," Brandon said, his voice low and steady. Gary tilted his head mockingly. "Or what? You're gonna stop us? Face it, old man, you don't scare us." Brandon took a single step forward, the movement deliberate. "You should be." The weight of his words hung in the air, the tension crackling like electricity. Todd and Mike froze mid-destruction, their eyes flicking toward Gary for direction. Gary smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've got a big mouth. Let's see if you've got the fight to back it up." The silence in the store was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of glass crunching under Todd's boot. Brandon didn't move from his position, standing firm near the counter. His calm demeanor seemed to irk Gary more than any insult could have. "Let's make this simple," Gary said, his voice low and menacing. "You give us what we want, or we start taking it ourselves." Brandon raised an eyebrow, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've already taken enough. Now clean it up and leave before I make you." Gary let out a sharp laugh, turning to Todd and Mike. "You hear that? He thinks he's gonna make us leave. Like he's got some kind of power here." Todd snorted, picking up another jar and tossing it lazily between his hands. "Maybe we ought to teach him who's really in charge. These types always need a little extra convincing." Brandon's expression hardened. He kept his gaze on Todd but addressed Gary. "What's that supposed to mean?" Gary smirked, leaning casually against the counter. "Oh, come on. Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean. Look at this place. Barely hanging on, just like the rest of them. You people are all the same, thinking you can play shopkeeper in neighborhoods like this." The words were a slap, but Brandon didn't flinch. He'd heard worse before. "What people?" he asked, his tone even. Gary's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You know what I'm talking about. Black-owned, minority-owned, whatever. You think you're building something real, but all you're doing is squatting on property someone else could actually use." "Someone like us," Todd laughed, tossing the jar onto a nearby shelf. "Yeah, we're doing you a favor. You're not cut out for this kind of work. Let the real owners take over. Brandon's fists tightened at his sides, but his voice stayed calm. You mean criminals like you? You think you're the real owners? Gary leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Call it what you want, but when we're done, there won't be a single one of these stores left standing. You can either take what we're offering, or you can lose everything. You don't scare me, Brandon said coldly. Gary's patience snapped. You don't get it, do you? He snarled, shoving Brandon hard against the counter. Brandon grunted, but didn't lose his footing. Instead, he leaned into the counter slightly, using it for balance as he steadied himself. You just made a mistake, Brandon said, his voice low and steady. Todd laughed, stepping forward with his fists clenched. Nah, old man, the mistake was yours, thinking we'd let you off easy. Brandon's gaze flicked briefly to Todd, and then back to Gary. You had your chance to walk away. The words were barely out of his mouth before Gary swung. The punch came fast, aimed squarely at Brandon's jaw, but Brandon's reflexes were faster. He ducked, sidestepping smoothly and using Gary's momentum against him. Gary stumbled forward, crashing into the counter. Todd charged next, but Brandon was ready. With a sharp pivot, he planted a kick to Todd's midsection, sending him sprawling onto the floor. The crash reverberated through the store, the shelves rattling from the force. Mike didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed a heavy wrench from his jacket and rushed forward, emboldened by Gary's shouted command. Get him! Brandon spun to meet Mike's attack, his hand shooting out to grab Mike's wrist mid-swing. The wrench stopped inches from Brandon's face, and with a swift, practiced motion, Brandon twisted Mike's arm, forcing him to drop the tool with a clatter. You picked the wrong fight, Brandon warned, his voice like steel. Gary recovered first, pulling a knife from his pocket and flipping it open with a click. The blade gleamed under the fluorescent lights as he advanced on Brandon. Big mistake, old man. You think you're tough? Let's see how tough you are now. Brandon didn't wait for him to strike. He moved quickly, closing the gap between them and deflecting Gary's knife hand with a sharp, practiced motion. The knife clattered to the floor, and before Gary could react, Brandon drove his knee into Gary's gut, doubling him over. Todd, having regained his footing, grabbed a crowbar from the mess on the floor and swung it at Brandon. The metal whistled through the air, but Brandon ducked just in time, the bar missing him by inches. He retaliated with a precise strike to Todd's knee, sending him down again with a howl of pain. Mike scrambled back to his feet, grabbing a piece of shelving to use as a weapon. He swung wildly, but Brandon sidestepped and shoved him backward, sending him crashing into a stack of boxes. Gary, still clutching his stomach, managed to stumble upright. He glared at Brandon, his eyes burning with rage. You think this is over? He snarled. You're gonna regret this, old man. Brandon didn't respond. His breathing was heavy, but his stance remained firm, his gaze steady. Todd and Mike regrouped, positioning themselves behind Gary. The three men stood there, bruised and battered but refusing to back down. The tension in the store was suffocating, the air thick with the promise of more violence. You're not gonna win this, Gary said, his voice filled with venom. You're just one guy. We're gonna break you. Brandon took a step forward, his presence enough to make even Todd flinch. You've already lost, he said, his voice cold and unyielding. The standoff continued, the tension crackling like electricity. For a long moment, neither side moved, both waiting for the other to make the next move. The tension in the store was unbearable. The air so thick, it felt like it could snap. Brandon stood firm, his calm gaze locked on the three men who loomed before him. Bruised, but not defeated. Gary sneered, his hand flexing near his side as though itching for another swing. You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that, Gary said, his voice dripping with malice. But guts don't count for much when you're outnumbered. Todd cracked his knuckles, his lip curling into a cruel grin. You really should have just handed over the cash. Would have saved you a lot of pain. Brandon didn't flinch. You don't belong here, he said evenly, his voice cutting through the silence. This is my store, my community. You'll leave one way or another." Gary's smirk twisted into a snarl, and without warning, he lunged forward. This time, Brandon couldn't sidestep quickly enough. Gary's shoulder caught him in the chest, slamming him back against the counter with a grunt. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but Brandon didn't falter. He grabbed the edge of the counter to steady himself and retaliated with a sharp elbow to Gary's side. Gary grunted, staggering back, but Todd was already moving. Todd came at him from the side, swinging a crowbar he'd snatched from the floor. Brandon ducked, the metal whistling just inches above his head. But before he could recover, Todd kicked out, catching Brandon in the ribs. Pain exploded in his side, and he stumbled, his back hitting a shelf. Mike, emboldened by the sight of Brandon faltering, charged in with a piece of broken shelving. He swung wildly, but Brandon managed to deflect the blow with his forearm, though the impact sent a jolt of pain through his arm. He gritted his teeth, grabbing the improvised weapon and yanking it out of Mike's hands. Using the momentum, Brandon swung the piece of shelving, catching Mike in the shoulder and sending him sprawling to the floor. But the victory was short-lived. Gary was back on him, throwing a flurry of punches. Brandon blocked as many as he could, but one caught him square in the jaw, snapping his head to the side. Stars danced in his vision, and he felt red liquid trickle from his lip. "Not so tough now, are you?" Gary taunted, grabbing Brandon by the shirt and shoving him against the wall. Brandon's breath came in ragged gasps, but he refused to back down. With a sudden burst of strength, he twisted out of Gary's grip and drove his fist into Gary's stomach. Gary doubled over, but Todd was already closing in. Brandon turned just in time to see the crowbar swinging toward his head. He barely managed to block it with his arm, but the force sent him stumbling again. Pain shot through his ribs, his injuries slowing him down, but his mind stayed sharp. "You're gonna regret this, old man," Todd shouted, raising the crowbar again. Brandon didn't give him the chance. He surged forward, tackling Todd to the ground. The two struggled briefly, but Brandon's training gave him the upper hand. He twisted the crowbar out of Todd's hands and tossed it across the store before delivering a swift punch that left Todd dazed on the floor. Gary and Mike regrouped, their faces twisted with fury. "Let's finish this," Gary barked, grabbing a knife from the floor where it had fallen earlier. Brandon backed toward the counter, his breathing labored, but his resolve unbroken. "You want this store?" he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "Then come take it." Gary charged with the knife, but Brandon moved like lightning. He sidestepped, grabbed Gary's wrist, and slammed it against the counter, forcing the knife to clatter to the floor again. With a swift motion, Brandon delivered a knee to Gary's chest, sending him stumbling back. Mike hesitated for a moment, glancing at Todd, who was still groaning on the floor, then at Gary. But Gary barked, "Get him!" and Mike rushed forward. Brandon was ready. He stepped into Mike's charge, using the man's momentum to throw him off balance. With one final shove, he sent Mike crashing into a pile of fallen shelves, the metal groaning under his weight. Gary, seeing his crew incapacitated, stumbled back toward the door. His confidence was gone, replaced by a look of pure rage. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "We're not done with you, not by a long shot." Brandon didn't answer. He stood his ground, his stance unwavering despite the pain coursing through his body. Gary grabbed Todd by the arm, dragging him toward the exit. Mike managed to stagger to his feet, following close behind. The three men backed out of the store, their threats echoing in the silence. Brandon stayed where he was, watching them retreat through the shattered front door. His chest heaved with labored breaths, his body screaming in protest, but he refused to show weakness. As the pickup truck roared to life and sped away, Brandon allowed himself a moment to lean against the counter. The store was a wreck, and his body felt like it had been through a war, but he was still standing. And for now, that was enough. The ringing in Brandon's ears had barely begun to fade when the sound of sirens filled the air outside. Red and blue lights flickered through the shattered windows of the store, casting sharp reflections on the debris-strewn floor. Brandon straightened slowly, wincing as pain lanced through his side. His ribs felt tender, likely bruised, and his lip was split, blood still dripping onto his chin. The bell above the door jingled faintly as the first officer stepped inside, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. The man's eyes scanned the chaos: overturned shelves, shattered jars, the scattered remains of Brandon's stock. Another officer followed, this one carrying a clipboard. She looked around, her gaze settling on Brandon, who was leaning heavily against the counter. "Sir, are you injured?" she asked, her voice cautious but professional. Brandon nodded once, wiping the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. "I'm fine," he said, though his hoarse voice betrayed the strain he was under. "Fine?" the first officer said, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. "This place looks like a war zone. What happened here?" Brandon straightened, ignoring the sharp protest from his ribs. "I was attacked," he said simply. "3 men tried to rob the store. They didn't like the answer I gave them." The female officer glanced at the damage again, her brow furrowing. "Attacked? And you fought them off?" Brandon met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. "They didn't leave me much of a choice." The first officer, clearly skeptical, looked Brandon up and down. 3 men? And you're saying you took them all on by yourself?" Brandon didn't rise to the bait. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The female officer stepped forward, her tone more measured. "Do you know these men? Have you seen them before?" Brandon hesitated. He thought about the things Gary had said, the racist taunts, the threats to his community. "No," he said finally, "but I know their type. They're not here for the money. They're here to intimidate." The first officer frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Brandon leaned heavily on the counter, his expression hardening. "They're targeting people like me, black business owners, minorities in this neighborhood. They're trying to scare us into selling our properties so they can profit off the destruction." The officers exchanged a glance, and the woman scribbled something on her clipboard. "That's a serious accusation," she said. "Do you have any evidence to support it?" Brandon gestured to the store. "Does this look random to you? They didn't just try to rob me. They wanted to send a message, and it's not the first time I've heard about something like this happening around here." The male officer crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "And you didn't think to call us before taking matters into your own hands?" Brandon's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I hit the silent alarm as soon as they started making threats. Didn't have time to wait for help." The female officer glanced at the security cameras mounted in the corners of the store. "Do those work?" "They do," Brandon said. "Footage is backed up automatically. You'll have everything you need to identify them." The male officer walked toward one of the toppled shelves, crouching to pick up a shattered jar. "This kind of damage isn't gonna look good for you," he muttered. "You sure you didn't escalate things?" Brandon's voice was sharp. "I defended myself. They came in here looking for trouble, and they found it." The female officer shot her partner a look, before turning back to Brandon. "We'll need to review the footage and take your statement. Can you describe the men?" Brandon nodded. 3 of them. The leader's about 6 feet. White, mid-40s, with a scar on his cheek. Second guy's stocky, bald, probably in his 30s. Third's younger, tall, lanky, had a nervous look about him. They were driving a beat-up pickup truck. Blue, I think. The female officer wrote everything down, nodding as she went. "All right, we'll put out a bulletin and see what we can find. In the meantime, do you need medical attention? You look like you took a pretty bad hit." Brandon shook his head. "I'll be fine." The male officer sighed, standing up and brushing his hands on his uniform. "You're lucky you didn't end up worse off. Next time, maybe leave it to us." Brandon's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to explain himself to someone who couldn't understand what it meant to defend something more than property. The officers moved toward the door, the female one pausing to look back. "We'll be in touch after we review the footage. If you think of anything else, call us." Brandon nodded, watching as they stepped outside and began talking near their squad car. The store was quiet again, the only sound the faint hum of the lights and the distant wail of another siren in the city. He looked around at the wreckage, his ribs throbbing with every breath. For a moment, Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it aside. There was too much at stake to rest now. Brandon knew this wasn't over. The men would come back, or worse, they'd target someone else. He couldn't let that happen. The store was a mess, but Brandon had no time to worry about the damage. After the police left, he locked the front door and sat behind the counter, his mind racing. Every word Gary had said replayed in his head. The sneering insults, the veiled threats, the racist justification for their actions. It wasn't random. They were targeting him, and likely others in the neighborhood, for a reason. Brandon gingerly touched his ribs, wincing as he moved. The injuries would slow him down, but not enough to stop him. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the grainy feed from the security cameras. The image of Gary and his crew walking into the store played on a loop. Every second of their arrogance and aggression seared into his memory. He rewound the footage to the moment they arrived. The truck. It was a beat-up blue pickup, the kind that didn't exactly blend into the neighborhood. He zoomed in, catching part of the license plate. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start with. Brandon grabbed his phone and pulled up a contact. An old army buddy named Marcus, who now worked in cybersecurity. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice sharp and professional. "Brandon, been a while. What's going on?" "I need a favor," Brandon said, his tone clipped. "Some guys hit my store. They're part of something bigger, targeting businesses like mine. I've got a partial plate number. Can you run it?" There was a pause on the other end. "You're not planning to handle this yourself, are you?" Marcus asked. Brandon didn't answer directly. "I just need to know who they are." Marcus sighed, but Brandon could hear him typing in the background. "All right. Give me the numbers." Brandon rattled off what he could see from the footage. A few moments later, Marcus exhaled sharply. "Got it. The truck's registered to a guy named Todd Andrews. He's got a record. Breaking and entering, aggravated assault, minor drug charges. Address is in the next neighborhood over." Brandon grabbed a notebook and jotted the information down. "Appreciate it. You sure you don't want to loop in the cops?" Marcus pressed. "They're already involved," Brandon replied, which wasn't exactly a lie. "But I'm not waiting for them to do their job," Marcus grunted. "Be careful, man. You're not in the field anymore." "Thanks for the concern," Brandon said, ending the call. He stared at the address in his notebook, weighing his options. Showing up unprepared wasn't an option, so he went to the back room where he kept a small safe. Inside were the tools he hoped he'd never need again: a tactical flashlight, a collapsible baton, and a sturdy pair of gloves. He strapped them on methodically, his movements slow but steady, despite the ache in his ribs. By the time he stepped out of the store, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. He moved with purpose, locking the door behind him and slipping into his car. The neighborhood whizzed by as he drove, the familiar streets a blur as his mind stayed focused on the task ahead. The address Marcus had provided led him to a run-down warehouse on the outskirts of the next neighborhood. The lot was surrounded by a chain-link fence, the gate hanging loosely on its hinges. Brandon parked a block away and approached on foot, his steps silent despite the gravel crunching underfoot. The warehouse was dimly lit, a single bulb over the entrance casting weak light across the cracked pavement. Brandon crouched behind a stack of old pallets, watching as two men, Todd and Mike, stood near the door, smoking and laughing, their voices carried in the still night air. "You see the look on that guy's face?" Todd said, grinning as he exhaled a plume of smoke. "Thought he was some kind of tough guy." Mike chuckled. "Yeah, well, Gary's gonna make sure he don't think that for long." "You hear what he's planning?" Todd snorted. "Course I did. That old man's not gonna know what hit him. Neither will the rest of these people. They're all gonna fold, one by one." Brandon's jaw tightened. His instincts told him to move now, but he forced himself to stay still. He needed more. "What's the boss saying about the next steps?" Mike asked. Todd shrugged. "Same as always. Intimidate. Wreck some places. Scare 'em good. Then Harrington's people sweep in. Buy it all up. Easy money." Brandon's breath caught. Harrington. He knew that name. Vincent Harrington was a shady developer with a reputation for gentrifying neighborhoods at any cost. If he was involved, this wasn't just about Brandon's store. It was a coordinated effort to displace the entire community. Mike stomped out his cigarette. "You think Gary's gonna come back for the store tomorrow?" Todd grinned. "Hell yeah! And this time, we'll finish the job." Brandon had heard enough. He slipped back into the shadows, his mind racing. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but now he had a clearer picture of what he was up against. As he moved silently back to his car, he made a promise to himself. Whatever it took, he would stop them. Brandon sat in his car a block away from the warehouse, the weight of what he'd overheard pressing heavily on his chest. Harrington's name wasn't just a clue, it was a revelation. The developer had long been rumored to be involved in shady deals, using underhanded tactics to drive minority communities out of their neighborhoods. Now Brandon had confirmation that the gang was part of that machine, the enforcers sent to sow fear and chaos. But the question remained, how could he prove it? And how deep did this operation go? The glow of a street lamp illuminated his notebook as Brandon flipped it open and began jotting down everything he'd heard. Names, locations, and tactics. They all painted a grim picture. Todd and Mike had confirmed that Gary planned to return to the store, but more importantly, they'd revealed Harrington's larger scheme. Brandon's mind raced. This wasn't just about defending his store anymore. If he could gather enough evidence, he could dismantle the entire operation and protect not just himself, but his neighbors. He stared at the warehouse, his jaw tightening. A direct confrontation here wasn't the right move. The men inside weren't the top of the chain. Gary, Todd, and Mike were small-time players, brutal and dangerous, but not the masterminds. Harrington was the real target, and to take him down, Brandon needed more than just hearsay. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. A text from Detective Maria Alvarez lit up. "Reviewed the footage. Sending out APB on the truck. Need anything else?" Brandon hesitated before typing back. "Can you get me anything on Vincent Harrington? Real estate deals? Business ties? Anything suspicious?" The response came quickly. "That's a big ask. What are you into, Brandon?" He didn't reply. Instead, he started the car and drove back toward the neighborhood, his thoughts focused on his next steps. The streets were quiet when Brandon pulled into the alley behind his store. The mess inside was still waiting for him, but it wasn't his priority. He stepped into his small office at the back, locking the door behind him. The safe under his desk held more than just tools. It contained a flash drive loaded with software he hadn't used in years. Brandon slid the drive into his laptop and leaned back in his chair as the program launched. During his military career, he'd learned more than just combat skills. He'd picked up techniques for surveillance and reconnaissance, tools meant for tracking enemies in war zones. Now, he was repurposing them to uncover the web of corruption surrounding Harrington. The software pinged as it connected to public records and online databases. Brandon started typing furiously, pulling up information on Harrington's company, its recent property acquisitions, and the shell corporations tied to his name. Patterns began to emerge. Properties sold at suspiciously low prices, all located in predominantly minority neighborhoods. As he sifted through the data, a familiar name appeared in multiple transactions. Vincent Harrington Development, LLC. Brandon frowned. The same company had purchased properties near his store, each deal following reports of vandalism or violence. His fingers flew across the keyboard, digging deeper. Emails leaked in a local scandal years ago linked Harrington to a known gang leader, an enforcer in another city who had used similar tactics to drive families out of their homes. The pieces were falling into place, but Brandon needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed something concrete. By the time the sun began to rise, Brandon had a plan. He would confront Gary again, not to fight, but to push for information. The gang was too confident, too careless. They'd let something slip if provoked the right way. His ribs ached as he stood, stretching after hours of sitting hunched over his laptop. He gathered his notes and secured them in a drawer before heading out to clean up the store. The shattered glass and scattered merchandise were a stark reminder of the violence that had unfolded, but Brandon's resolve only hardened as he swept the floor. The bell above the door jingled, and Brandon tensed instinctively before recognizing the familiar face of Detective Alvarez. She stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning the damage. "Looks worse in person," she said, crossing her arms. "Good to see you too," Brandon replied, his voice tinged with dry humor. Maria's gaze softened slightly. "You shouldn't be doing this alone," she said. "This isn't just some petty crime ring. These guys are connected to people with power." "I know," Brandon said, meeting her eyes. "That's why I can't back down." Maria sighed, shaking her head. "I looked into Harrington like you asked. He's got layers of protection. Legal, financial, and otherwise. If you're planning to go after him, you'll need more than a hunch." "I'm working on it," Brandon said, gesturing toward the back room. "I've already found enough to link him to property deals tied to violence and intimidation. It's a start." Maria hesitated. "You're going to get yourself hurt, Brandon. These people don't play fair." "Neither do I," he said, his voice steady. "But I play to win." Maria exhaled sharply. "Fine. I'll keep digging. But if you cross a line, don't expect me to cover for you." "I wouldn't ask you to," Brandon replied. Maria left shortly after, leaving Brandon alone again in the quiet store. He knew the risks, but he also knew he couldn't stop. His community's future depended on what he did next. As he locked the door and prepared for Gary's inevitable return, Brandon felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about his store anymore. It was a fight for something far bigger. By the time the sun began its climb to midday, Brandon's plan was in motion. He had spent the early hours cleaning up the store just enough to make it appear open for business, while his real focus was on preparing for what was coming. Gary and his crew would return. He was sure of that. But this time, Brandon wouldn't be standing alone. Detective Maria Alvarez had been reluctant when Brandon called her early that morning. Her voice carried a mix of skepticism and concern as he laid out his plan. "You're sure they'll come back?" Maria asked. "They don't know when to quit," Brandon replied. "They think they're untouchable." "This is how we prove them wrong." Maria hesitated. "And you're absolutely certain you can handle this until we get there?" "I'll be fine," Brandon said, though the ache in his ribs told a different story. "Just make sure your team is ready." As the minutes ticked by, Brandon double-checked everything. The store's security cameras were positioned to capture every angle, and a small recording device sat under the counter, activated and ready. Outside, an unmarked police car idled a few blocks away, its occupants waiting for Brandon's signal. He adjusted the silent alarm, testing it to ensure it would alert the officers without triggering the loud, obvious chime. If things went as planned, the gang wouldn't realize the police were involved until it was too late. The bell above the door jingled around noon. Brandon's muscles tensed as he looked up to see a few regular customers wandering in. He greeted them with a nod, forcing himself to maintain a calm exterior despite the storm brewing inside. By 12:30, the store was empty again. The silence felt heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Brandon stood behind the counter, his hand resting just beneath it, hovering near the alarm. He didn't have to wait long. The low growl of a truck engine reached his ears before the vehicle came into view. Brandon didn't move as the blue pickup pulled up in front of the store, its tires crunching on the pavement. The bell jingled as Gary entered, flanked by Todd and Mike. The three men strode in with the same arrogance as before, their eyes scanning the store like they owned it. Gary's grin widened when he saw Brandon behind the counter. "Well, well," Gary said, spreading his arms as he approached. "Look who's still here. I was starting to think you'd finally gotten smart and packed up." Brandon kept his expression neutral. "I told you before, this store isn't going anywhere." Todd snorted, picking up a jar from the nearest shelf and examining it lazily. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Mike smirked, leaning against a display rack. "Yeah, and this time, we're not just here to talk." Brandon's hand hovered near the alarm. He waited for the right moment, watching as Gary stepped closer. "You should have listened," Gary said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Now we've got to make an example out of you." Brandon let his hand press down on the alarm, activating the silent signal to the officers waiting nearby. He straightened, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Go ahead," he said. "Let's see how far you get." Gary's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he covered it with a sneer. "You've got a real mouth on you. You know that?" Todd stepped forward, raising the jar as if to throw it, but a sharp sound from outside stopped him. The distant whine of sirens was growing louder, closing in fast. Gary turned toward the door, his expression shifting to confusion. "What the hell?" Brandon folded his arms. "You didn't think I'd let you keep running this game, did you?" The sirens grew deafening as two police cars screeched to a stop in front of the store. Officers poured out, their weapons drawn as they shouted commands. "Hands up!" one officer barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Get down on the ground, now!" Gary's face twisted with rage as he turned back to Brandon. "You set us up?" Brandon met his glare, his voice calm and steady. "I gave you a chance to walk away. You didn't take it." Todd dropped the jar with a crash, raising his hands as two officers entered the store. Mike hesitated, looking to Gary for guidance, but the sight of a third officer closing in made him follow suit. Gary stayed still, his fists clenched at his sides as he glared at Brandon. "This isn't over," he growled. "Yes, it is," Brandon said. The officers moved in, handcuffing the three men as they read them their rights. Gary continued to shout threats, but Todd and Mike stayed silent, their confidence shattered. As the police led the gang outside, Detective Alvarez stepped into the store. She glanced around at the mess, then at Brandon, her expression unreadable. "Nice work," she said finally. "We'll see what they give us once they start talking." Brandon nodded, but his gaze lingered on the door where Gary had been dragged out. This was just the beginning. Harrington was still out there, and Brandon knew the fight was far from over. The store felt strangely quiet after the chaos. Brandon sat in the back office, the hum of his laptop the only sound breaking the silence. His ribs ached, his face stung from the bruises, but his mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand. The arrest of Gary and his crew was a victory, but Brandon knew it was only the first step. Harrington was the real prize, and now the pieces were starting to come together. Detective Maria Alvarez had stayed behind after the arrests, poring over Brandon's security footage and the audio recordings from the confrontation. Now, she stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and her face etched with concern. "We've got enough to hold them," Maria said. "Gary's already ranting about how he's just doing a job. He's trying to push the blame up the chain, but he hasn't said Harrington's name yet." Brandon nodded, scrolling through the information he'd compiled on Harrington's shady property acquisitions. "He will. Guys like Gary only stay loyal until the heat gets too high." Maria sighed, pulling out her phone and flipping through messages. "We've got patrol units sweeping Harrington's known properties, but he's smart. Everything's tied up in shell corporations and third-party fronts. We'll need something concrete to connect him to this operation." Brandon leaned back, his fingers steepled in thought. Gary and his crew have to be the weak link. They're small-time enforcers, not masterminds. If we apply enough pressure, one of them will crack. Maria raised an eyebrow. "You sound awfully confident for someone who just walked out of a fight with 3 guys. Brandon allowed himself a faint smile. "I've been in worse situations. Besides, this isn't about me. It's about the community. Harrington's been bleeding this neighborhood dry for years, and these thugs are just his tools. If we don't stop him, he'll keep doing it." Maria studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll push the DA for expedited charges on Gary and his crew. If they see the threat of real prison time, they might start talking." In the meantime, she trailed off, looking pointedly at Brandon's bruised face. "I'll rest when this is over," he said firmly, cutting off her unspoken suggestion. Maria shook her head, but a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Stubborn as ever. Fine. But be careful. Harrington's the type to play dirty when he feels cornered." As Maria left, Brandon turned his attention back to his screen. The flash drive he'd plugged in earlier contained weeks of research, public records, leaked emails, and connections he'd pieced together about Harrington's empire. Patterns began to emerge, linking Harrington's developments to a series of violent incidents across the city. Brandon's fingers flew across the keyboard, compiling the data into a cohesive timeline. Each bullet point added another layer to the story. Properties bought at rock-bottom prices after vandalism, arson, or threats. Businesses pressured to sell by anonymous buyers who disappeared once the deals were finalized. Harrington was the puppet master, and Gary's gang was just one of many strings he pulled. One email in particular caught Brandon's eye. It was an exchange between Harrington and a known fixer, a man whose name had surfaced in multiple property deals tied to questionable tactics. The language was vague, but it was clear Harrington was orchestrating more than just real estate transactions. Brandon's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Maria. "Got something," she said. "Gary's lawyer just called to cut a deal. He's ready to talk." Brandon sat up straighter. "What's he offering?" Maria's voice was cautious, but hopeful. "Details on Harrington's operations. He claims he's been delivering payments directly to Harrington's people. Cash drops, documents, everything. If it checks out, we'll have a direct link." Brandon exhaled slowly, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "That's what we need." "There's more," Maria continued. "Gary mentioned something about a property Harrington's been pushing hard to acquire, an old community center a few blocks from your store. He said there's a meeting happening tonight between Harrington's fixer and another crew, planning the next move." Brandon's mind raced. The community center was a cornerstone of the neighborhood, a place where families gathered and kids stayed off the streets. If Harrington was targeting it, the stakes were higher than ever. "Where's the meeting?" Brandon asked. Maria hesitated. "It's risky, Brandon." "Let us handle it." "Where is it?" he repeated, his voice firm. There was a pause before Maria relented. "An abandoned factory on the edge of town. I'll text you the address, but promise me you'll be careful. If you go in there guns blazing, you'll blow the whole operation." Brandon's lips curved into a grim smile. "I don't need guns. I just need the truth." The factory loomed dark and foreboding as Brandon approached later that evening. He parked a few blocks away, moving on foot to avoid detection. The building's broken windows and rusted exterior made it look like it had been abandoned for years, but the faint glow of lights inside told a different story. Brandon slipped into the shadows, his steps silent as he crept closer. He could hear voices echoing faintly from within, low, gruff tones discussing plans, payments, and threats. He pressed himself against the wall near a shattered window, peering inside. A group of men stood around a table littered with papers and cash. At the head of the table was a man Brandon recognized from his research. Harrington's fixer. Brandon's jaw tightened. This was the proof they needed. Now, he just had to get it, without getting caught. The cold night air bit at Brandon's skin as he crouched beneath a broken window of the factory. From his vantage point, he could see the table where Harrington's fixer and his crew were gathered. The soft hum of conversation reached his ears, low, deliberate, and dangerous. Brandon's eyes narrowed as he focused on the man leading the discussion. The fixer was tall and thin, his sharp features illuminated by the dim light of a hanging bulb. Papers and cash were spread across the table, but it was the blueprint at the center that caught Brandon's attention. The layout of the community center was unmistakable. "Gary's crew made a mess," the fixer said, his tone cold and clipped. "But we've got other options. If Carter's Market doesn't fall in line, we'll focus on the community center next. A few well-placed accidents should do the trick." Brandon's fists clenched, his ribs protesting the tension. He reached for his phone, silently activating the recording app. The conversation inside was his proof. A burly man standing near the fixer chuckled, cracking his knuckles. "That place is a sitting duck. Half the people who go there can't even afford a lawyer. They'll fold fast once we start breaking things." The fixer smirked. "Exactly. Harrington wants this done quickly. So we'll move in tomorrow night. No loose ends." Brandon felt a surge of anger. The fixer spoke about destroying lives with the casual indifference of someone ordering lunch. The sound of boots scuffing against the concrete floor jolted him back to the moment. One of the men was pacing toward the window where Brandon hid. He pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath as the man's shadow passed inches from his position. Inside, the conversation continued. "Harrington's been clear. No more mistakes," the fixer said, his voice sharper now. "I don't care what you have to do. This neighborhood is a gold mine, and we're not letting a few stubborn holdouts get in the way." Brandon slipped quietly to the side of the building, moving toward another entrance. He needed more than just audio. He needed to see the documents on that table. The back door was unlocked, its rusted hinges creaking softly as Brandon eased it open. He slipped inside, the factory's shadows swallowing him. Keeping low, he moved toward the table, using the scattered machinery and crates for cover. The men were focused on their discussion, oblivious to Brandon's presence. He stopped behind a stack of pallets, close enough now to see the blueprints in detail. Notes were scrawled across the paper. Times, access points, and plans to stage a fire at the community center. Brandon pulled his phone from his pocket, snapping a photo of the documents. The shutter sound was nearly inaudible, but it was enough to draw attention. "What was that?" one of the men said, turning toward the shadows. Brandon froze, his heart pounding. The fixer raised a hand, silencing the others. "Check it out," he ordered, his cold eyes scanning the room. Two of the men began moving toward Brandon's position, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Brandon slipped further into the shadows, his movements deliberate and silent. He needed to stay calm, to draw them away from the evidence without revealing himself. The first man rounded the corner of the pallets, his flashlight beam sweeping over the floor. Brandon waited until the man turned slightly, then moved swiftly. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it sharply, and delivered a controlled strike to his side. The man crumpled without a sound. The second man spun around, his flashlight catching the faint movement. "Hey!" he started, but Brandon was already on him. A quick blow to the neck silenced him, and he collapsed into a heap. The commotion was enough to alert the others. "We've got company!" the fixer shouted, reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband. Brandon darted back into the shadows, his mind racing. The factory was a maze, but he knew he couldn't rely on hiding forever. He needed to disrupt their operation. And fast. Spotting a stack of crates near the table, Brandon made his move. He shoved the stack hard, sending it crashing onto the table. Papers and cash scattered, and the blueprints crumpled beneath the weight. "Over there!" someone yelled, and the remaining men charged toward him. Brandon used the chaos to his advantage, weaving through the machinery and crates. He led them toward the far side of the factory, drawing them away from the evidence. The fixer, however, didn't follow. He crouched near the ruined table, frantically gathering what he could. Brandon cursed under his breath. He couldn't let the man escape with those plans. Just as the fixer stood, clutching the blueprints, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the factory windows, and the fixer's expression twisted into panic. "Cops!" one of the men shouted. The group scattered, but the police were already closing in. Officers burst through the front and back entrances, their weapons drawn. "Hands in the air!" one officer barked. Brandon stepped out from the shadows, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. The fixer tried to make a break for it, but two officers tackled him to the ground, the blueprints falling from his grasp. Maria entered a moment later, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. She locked eyes with Brandon and nodded. "Good work." Brandon exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The fight wasn't over, but they'd taken a critical step. Harrington's operation was starting to crumble, and Brandon wasn't about to let up. The next day, the cold fluorescent lights in the interrogation room cast a harsh glow over Gary's face. He sat slouched in the chair, his wrists cuffed to the table, his lips split, and a bruise darkening his cheek. Across from him, Detective Maria Alvarez placed a file on the table with deliberate precision, her expression unreadable. Behind the one-way mirror, Brandon stood watching, his ribs aching but his resolve unshaken. "He's stubborn," Maria said, glancing back at Brandon through the glass. "But he's not untouchable. You want in on this?" Brandon nodded, stepping into the room. Gary's eyes narrowed as Brandon entered, his posture stiffening. "Well, well," Gary sneered, "if it isn't the tough guy. You come here to gloat?" Brandon sat across from him, his gaze steady. "I came to hear your excuses." Gary leaned back, forcing a cocky grin despite the tension in his shoulders. "I don't owe you anything." Maria folded her arms, standing beside the table. "No, but you owe us. You're facing a long list of charges, Gary. Assault, conspiracy, extortion. Your crew's already talking. Waller, too. It's only a matter of time before Harrington cuts you loose to save himself." Gary's grin faltered, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "You think I'm scared of you? Of him? Harrington doesn't need to cut me loose. He's untouchable. Always has been. Always will be." Brandon leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Untouchable, huh? Tell that to Waller. He's already giving us everything we need to take Harrington down. You think you're safe? You're a pawn in his game, Gary. Expendable." Gary's smirk faded entirely, replaced by a glare. "Waller's full of it. He doesn't know anything." Maria opened the file, sliding a photo of the community center blueprint across the table. "Really? Because this says otherwise. We've got recordings, documents, and statements tying you directly to Harrington's operations. The only thing we don't have is your side of the story. This is your one chance to get ahead of this before you're buried under the fallout." Gary stared at the photo, his jaw tightening. "You think you can scare me? I've been through worse than this." Brandon's voice was quiet, but firm. "Worse than prison? Because that's where you're headed. And it won't just be you. Harrington won't hesitate to throw you under the bus if it means saving himself." Gary's fists clenched on the table, the cuffs rattling slightly. "You don't know him. You don't know what he's capable of." Maria leaned closer. "Then tell us. Show us you're smarter than him. Because right now, all we see is a guy who got caught doing someone else's dirty work." Gary hesitated, his gaze shifting between the photo and Brandon. The weight of his situation was sinking in, and the cracks in his defiance were starting to show. "What's in it for me?" he asked finally, his voice low. Maria straightened, her tone matter-of-fact. "Cooperate, and we'll push for reduced charges. Keep stonewalling, and you'll take the fall for everything. Harrington's crimes, Waller's operations, all of it. Your choice," Brandon added. "You've already lost the fight. Don't lose the chance to walk away with something." Gary exhaled sharply, his bravado crumbling. "All right," he muttered. "What do you want to know?" In the adjoining room, Waller was also talking, his cool demeanor cracking under the pressure of mounting evidence. Between Waller and Gary, Maria and Brandon pieced together the full scope of Harrington's operation. Gary detailed how he and his crew were instructed to target minority-owned businesses, using violence and intimidation to force owners to sell. He described the cash payments he delivered to Waller, who acted as the middleman between the enforcers and Harrington's corporate front. "It wasn't just us," Gary said, his voice bitter. "Harrington's got people all over. Different crews, different cities. We're just the ones who got caught." Maria's pen didn't stop moving as she scribbled notes. "And the community center?" she pressed. Gary hesitated before nodding. "He's been after that place for months. Says it's prime real estate for his next development. We were supposed to rough it up tomorrow, make it look like an accident, scare the owners into selling." Maria exchanged a glance with Brandon. It was the confirmation they needed. When the interrogation ended, Maria stepped into the hallway with Brandon, holding the thick stack of notes and evidence. "This is it," she said, her tone laced with determination. "Between Gary and Waller, we've got everything we need to move on Harrington." Brandon nodded, his expression grim. "Good, but be careful. Harrington's the kind of guy who doesn't go down without a fight." Maria smirked. "Neither are we." Back in the interrogation room, Gary sat alone, his head in his hands. The weight of betrayal was heavy on him, betrayed by Harrington, and now by his own need to survive. Meanwhile, Brandon knew the hardest part was yet to come. Harrington had run unchecked for years, but now the walls were closing in. And this time, Brandon wouldn't stop until the man who had destroyed so many lives was held accountable. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. As Maria compiled everything from the dual interrogations, Brandon sat quietly in the corner of her office, his eyes scanning the board on the wall. It was filled with photographs, maps, and handwritten notes, all connected by lines of string forming a web that pointed to one man, Vincent Harrington. Maria closed the thick file in front of her with a decisive snap. "We've got enough," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "Gary's testimony, Waller's confession, and the documents from the factory. Harrington can't talk his way out of this." Brandon nodded, his jaw tightening. "What's the plan?" Maria grabbed her phone, already dialing. "I'm getting a warrant. If we move now, we can catch him before he tries to disappear." Hours later, the operation was in motion. Maria's team had secured the warrant, and a convoy of unmarked police vehicles rolled through the city toward Harrington's sprawling office complex. It was a sleek, modern building that towered over the surrounding neighborhood, a stark contrast to the crumbling homes and businesses his schemes had targeted. Brandon rode with Maria in the lead car, his fists clenched on his lap. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of everything they'd fought for resting on this moment. "You sure you want to be here for this?" Maria asked, glancing at him. Brandon's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not letting him walk out of there without knowing the damage he's done." Maria nodded, understanding the determination in his tone. The convoy screeched to a halt in front of the building, officers pouring out with practiced efficiency. Brandon stayed close to Maria as they entered the lobby, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. A receptionist froze behind the desk, her eyes wide as Maria flashed her badge. "Detective Alvarez, MPD. We have a warrant for Vincent Harrington's arrest." The woman stammered something incomprehensible before pointing toward the elevator. Maria signaled to her team, and they moved swiftly, splitting into groups to secure the exits and sweep the upper floors. Brandon followed Maria into the elevator, the tension building with each passing floor. When the doors opened on the top level, they were met with the sight of Harrington's private office, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city he'd exploited for years. Harrington sat at a massive desk, his expensive suit crisp and unruffled. He didn't look surprised as Maria and Brandon entered, flanked by officers. If anything, he seemed almost amused. "Detective Alvarez," Harrington said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Maria held up the warrant. "Vincent Harrington, you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, racketeering, and multiple counts of coercion and intimidation." Harrington's smile didn't waver. "Those are some serious accusations. I trust you have evidence to back them up?" Brandon stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room like steel. "We do. Your fixer, Waller, gave you up. So did your enforcers. We have everything. Payments, blueprints, recordings. Your operation's done." Harrington's gaze shifted to Brandon, his smile faltering for the first time. "The store owner, I heard about your little altercation. You've been busy." "You destroyed lives," Brandon said coldly, his voice unwavering. "You tore apart communities for profit and left families with nothing. It ends today." Harrington stood slowly, his movements calculated. "You think this will stop anything?" he said, his tone laced with arrogance. "I have lawyers who will tear your so-called evidence apart. And even if you get a conviction, there are more like me waiting to take my place." Maria stepped closer, her voice sharp. "We'll take them down too, starting with you." Harrington's confidence cracked as two officers stepped forward to cuff him. He glared at Brandon, his composure slipping. "This isn't over," he growled. Brandon met his glare unflinching. "For you, it is." As the officers led Harrington away, Brandon stood by the windows, looking out over the city. The fight had taken its toll, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of relief. Maria joined him, her expression softening. "You did it," she said. Brandon shook his head. "We did it. But the real work starts now. Rebuilding what he tore down." Maria nodded, her voice filled with quiet determination. "And we will." That night, Brandon returned to his store. The shelves were still half empty, and the scars of the recent fight lingered in the broken tiles and splintered wood, but the lights were on, and the door was open. As he stood behind the counter, a few regular customers wandered in, offering him small smiles and words of encouragement. Brandon felt a flicker of hope. The community was still standing, and together they would rebuild. But first, he needed to deal with something more important. The days leading up to the trial were a whirlwind of preparation and tension. Brandon spent much of his time balancing the store's slow recovery with meetings at the police station and the prosecutor's office. Each session chipped away at the mystery of Harrington's empire, piecing together a picture of greed and calculated cruelty. Maria was relentless in her pursuit of justice, keeping Brandon updated every step of the way. They sat together in the back room of the store one evening, the table covered in files and photographs. Brandon leaned over a diagram of the community center, his jaw tightening as Maria pointed to handwritten notes detailing how Harrington had planned to destroy it. "This was his playbook," Maria said, her voice low. "He didn't just want to take properties. He wanted to erase what they stood for. That community center, your store, the others, they're not just businesses to him. They're obstacles." Brandon looked up from the papers, his eyes sharp. "Obstacles to what?" Maria sighed, crossing her arms. "To money, power, and control. Harrington doesn't see people. He sees opportunities. And anyone who doesn't fit into his plans gets steamrolled." Brandon sat back, exhaling slowly. "Then we make sure he doesn't steamroll anyone else." Maria nodded. "That's the plan. The prosecution's building their case around Waller's testimony and the documents you helped recover. But they're going to need you, too." "Me?" Brandon asked, raising an eyebrow. Maria gestured to the photos of the wrecked store, the blueprints from the factory, and the stack of depositions. "You're not just a victim in this. You're the one who started this fight. The jury needs to hear your story, to see what Harrington's greed has done to real people." Brandon hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. He wasn't one for public speaking, but he knew Maria was right. "I'll do it," he said finally. "Whatever it takes." The days passed quickly, each one bringing new developments. Maria worked tirelessly with the district attorney's office, ensuring every piece of evidence was airtight. Meanwhile, Brandon found himself meeting with the lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Cho. Evelyn spread a series of photos across the conference table during their first meeting, her tone brisk but encouraging. "You're a key witness, Mr. Carter," she said. "The jury needs to understand the stakes, what you've endured and what's at risk if we don't hold Harrington accountable." Brandon studied the photos, his store in shambles, the blueprints of the community center, and the surveillance footage showing Gary and his crew storming in. "I'll tell them," he said firmly. "All of it." Evelyn nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Good. Just speak from the heart. The defense is going to try to paint you as an overreacting business owner with a vendetta. But the truth is on our side." "Let them try," Brandon replied, his voice steady. "They'll hear the truth from me." As the trial date approached, the tension in the neighborhood grew palpable. Word of Harrington's arrest and the upcoming proceedings had spread quickly, and the community buzzed with quiet anticipation. People stopped by the store more frequently, offering words of encouragement and support. "You're doing this for all of us," Mrs. Jenkins said one afternoon, clutching her grocery bag tightly. "Don't let him win, Brandon." "I won't," Brandon assured her, though the weight of their expectations pressed heavily on his shoulders. At night, he found himself reflecting on how far they'd come. The fight with Gary and his crew, the relentless digging into Harrington's operations, and the arrests that followed. It all felt like a blur, but now they were on the cusp of something bigger. On the eve of the trial, Maria stopped by the store with coffee and a thick binder. She placed it on the counter with a sigh. "Here's everything you need to know about tomorrow." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "Homework?" Maria smirked. "Something like that. Look, you've done the hard part. Tomorrow, you just need to tell the truth. The jury will see Harrington for who he really is." Brandon nodded, flipping through the binder. It contained his statement, key pieces of evidence, and notes on the prosecution's strategy. He closed it with a snap and leaned against the counter, staring out at the darkened street. "What if it's not enough?" he asked quietly. Maria placed a hand on his shoulder. "It will be. People like Harrington think they're untouchable because no one stands up to them. But you did. And now, he's the one on trial." Brandon didn't reply, but her words gave him a sense of calm he hadn't felt in weeks. The morning of the trial dawned clear and cold. Brandon dressed in his best suit, the weight of the day ahead settling over him like a heavy coat. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, he thought about everything that had brought him here. The fights, the sacrifices, the community he was fighting for. He stepped outside to find Maria waiting by her car. She gave him a nod, her expression serious but reassuring. "Let's go," she said. Brandon climbed into the passenger seat, the courthouse looming in the distance. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready. The courtroom was silent as Brandon took the stand, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. The judge nodded toward him, and the clerk administered the oath. Brandon's voice was steady as he swore to tell the truth, but his hands gripped the edge of the witness stand tightly. He wasn't here just for himself. He was here for everyone who had suffered at the hands of Harrington's greed. Evelyn Cho approached, her expression calm but focused. She held a stack of papers in one hand and a single photo in the other. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone warm but firm, "can you tell the court why you decided to take a stand against Mr. Harrington's operation?" Brandon cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with quiet anger. "Because what they were doing wasn't just criminal, it was personal. They weren't just targeting businesses, they were targeting people like me, black business owners, families, communities that have worked hard to survive. Harrington's crew didn't care who they hurt, as long as they got what they wanted." Evelyn nodded, placing the photo on the evidence display. It was an image of Brandon's store after the attack. Shelves toppled, merchandise scattered, the front window shattered. The jury leaned forward, their expressions somber. "Walk us through the events of the attack," Evelyn said. "What happened that day?" Brandon took a deep breath. "3 men came into my store, Gary, Todd, and Mike. At first, they acted like customers, but it didn't take long for their real intentions to show. They started making demands. Money, control of the store. When I refused, they got aggressive. They knocked over shelves, broke merchandise, and threatened me." "And did they say anything specific to you during this confrontation?" Evelyn pressed. Brandon's jaw tightened, his voice dropping slightly. "They didn't just threaten my business. They made it clear they were targeting me because of who I am. They called me one of those people, said I didn't belong in the neighborhood, and that people like me don't know how to run a real business. It wasn't just about money. It was about sending a message." The words hung heavy in the courtroom, the tension palpable. Evelyn paused, giving the jury a moment to absorb what Brandon had said, before continuing. "And how did you respond?" she asked. "I told them they were wasting their time," Brandon said, his voice firm. "I wasn't going to back down." That's when things got physical. Gary shoved me into the counter, and the others started throwing punches. They didn't care about the damage they were doing, to me or the store. Evelyn gestured toward another photograph. This one of Brandon after the attack, his face bruised and bloodied. "And this is what they left you with?" Brandon nodded. "That's right, but I fought back. I had to. If I hadn't, I don't know what they would have done." Evelyn stepped closer to the jury box, her voice firm. "Mr. Carter, were you aware at the time that these men were working on behalf of Vincent Harrington?" "I suspected it," Brandon said. "They mentioned Harrington's name during the attack, saying he was the one who really owned the block. They were trying to intimidate me into giving up, just like they'd done to other businesses in the area." "And when you realized the scope of their operation?" Evelyn asked. Brandon's voice grew colder. "I knew I couldn't just sit back and let it happen. This wasn't just about my store. It was about stopping them from destroying an entire community." Evelyn nodded, stepping back slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." No further questions. The defense attorney, a tall man with a polished demeanor, stood slowly. He adjusted his suit jacket before approaching the stand. "Mr. Carter," he began smoothly, "you've painted quite the picture here today. But let's talk about your actions during this incident. You said you fought back. Isn't it true that you escalated the violence? Brandon's gaze hardened. I defended myself. There's a difference. The attorney smirked. Defended yourself? Against 3 men? That's quite the feat. Some might say you were looking for a fight. Brandon's voice remained calm, though his fists clenched on the stand. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wasn't going to let them walk all over me either. The attorney tilted his head, his tone dripping with condescension. And yet, you didn't call the police until after the damage was done. Why not? Because I didn't have time. Brandon shot back. They didn't give me a chance. And even if I had, I've seen what happens when people like me call for help. It doesn't always come. The courtroom fell silent at Brandon's words. The defense attorney hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. No further questions, he said quickly, returning to his seat. Brandon stepped down from the stand, his head held high. The tension in the courtroom was thick, but he felt a quiet strength in knowing he'd spoken his truth. As he returned to his seat beside Evelyn, she leaned over and whispered, "You did great." Brandon nodded, his gaze fixed on the jury. The fight wasn't over, but he had done his part. The courtroom's atmosphere was electric as Brandon left the stand. His testimony had left an indelible mark, his raw honesty cutting through the defense's attempts to paint him as combative or unreasonable. The jury's expressions ranged from somber to outright angry, their focus unshaken as Evelyn Cho called her next witness to the stand. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Eric Waller," Evelyn announced. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Waller entered, his face pale but composed. The fixer looked every bit the reluctant witness, his shoulders tense as he settled into the chair and swore his oath. Evelyn wasted no time. She approached with a folder in hand, flipping it open to reveal a series of incriminating documents. "Mr. Waller, you worked as a liaison between Vincent Harrington and various crews hired to intimidate property owners. Is that correct?" Waller's gaze flicked toward the defense table before he nodded. "Yes." "And during this time, were you aware of the methods these crews used to force property owners to sell?" Evelyn pressed. Waller hesitated, then sighed. "Yes." "Can you describe these methods for the court?" Waller swallowed hard, his voice quiet but steady. "They used threats, vandalism, and, in some cases, physical violence. The goal was to scare the owners into selling their properties below market value so Harrington could acquire them cheaply." Evelyn placed another document on the evidence display. It was a ledger, neatly organized with payments to various individuals. "And were you responsible for distributing payments to these crews?" Waller nodded again, his face tightening. "Yes. Harrington gave me the cash, and I delivered it." "Did Harrington ever express any concerns about the methods being used?" Evelyn asked, her tone sharp. Waller shook his head. "No. He knew exactly what was going on. He was the one giving the orders." The courtroom murmured again, the tension thickening. Evelyn stepped closer to the jury box, her voice rising slightly. "Mr. Waller, can you confirm that Harrington specifically ordered the targeting of minority-owned businesses in this scheme?" "Yes," Waller said after a moment of silence. "He said they were easy targets, that they didn't have the resources to fight back." Brandon's hands tightened into fists as he listened, but he forced himself to stay calm. The jury's reactions mirrored his outrage, their expressions darkening as Waller continued to speak. Evelyn nodded, her tone steady. "And what about the community center? Can you tell us what Harrington planned for that property?" Waller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wanted it demolished. Said it was prime real estate for luxury condos. He didn't care about the people who used it, just the profit. Evelyn allowed the weight of his words to settle over the room before presenting one final question. "Mr. Waller, do you believe Harrington knowingly orchestrated a campaign of intimidation and violence to achieve his goals?" Waller hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "Yes," he said quietly, "he did." The defense attorney rose, his polished demeanor intact despite the damage Waller's testimony had inflicted. He adjusted his tie as he approached the stand, his tone smooth. "Mr. Waller, You've admitted to participating in these activities. Isn't it true that you're testifying today to save yourself from harsher charges? Waller's jaw tightened. I'm cooperating because it's the right thing to do. The attorney smirked. The right thing to do? Or the convenient thing to do, now that you've been caught? Evelyn objected, her voice firm. Your Honor, the defense is badgering the witness. Sustained, the judge said, his tone clipped. Move on, counselor. The defense attorney's smirk faltered slightly, but he pressed on. Mr. Waller, you claim Harrington gave the orders, but where's the proof? Were there written instructions? Recordings of these alleged directives? Waller met his gaze, unflinching. No, Harrington didn't leave a paper trail. But I was there. I heard him give the orders myself. The defense attorney spread his hands. So, we're supposed to take your word for it? A man who admits to committing crimes for money? Waller didn't waver. Yes, because it's the truth. The defense attorney stepped back, his frustration barely concealed. No further questions. As Waller stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Evelyn returned to her seat, her confidence unshaken. She turned to Brandon and gave a faint nod, silently conveying that the case was moving in the right direction. The rest of the day was consumed by testimony from investigators and other witnesses, each piece of evidence adding weight to the prosecution's case. Harrington sat stoically at the defense table, but Brandon noticed the subtle cracks in his composure, the way his jaw tightened when certain documents were presented or his fingers drummed on the table during particularly damning testimony. By the time court adjourned for the day, Brandon felt a cautious sense of optimism. The jury had heard the truth, the racism, the violence, the greed that had driven Harrington's operation. Now, it was up to them to deliver justice. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the jury filed back in, their expressions solemn. Brandon sat in the gallery, his heart pounding in his chest. The weeks of testimony, evidence, and grueling cross-examinations had all led to this moment. Beside him, Maria sat still as stone, her sharp eyes fixed on the jury foreman holding the folded verdict in their hands. All rise, the bailiff intoned, and everyone in the courtroom stood as the judge took his seat. Once the formalities were complete, the judge gestured to the jury foreman. You may read the verdict. The foreman unfolded the paper, their voice clear and unwavering. On the charge of conspiracy to commit extortion, we find the defendant, Vincent Harrington, guilty. On the charge of racketeering, we find the defendant, guilty. On the charge of coercion and intimidation, guilty. The words hit like a hammer, each guilty sending a ripple through the courtroom. Brandon exhaled slowly, his fists unclenching as the tension began to lift. Harrington's shoulders sagged slightly, his polished exterior cracking under the weight of the jury's decision. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them before turning to Harrington. Mr. Harrington, you have been convicted on multiple serious charges. Your actions have caused widespread harm, disrupting lives and dismantling communities for your own financial gain. This court finds your behavior egregious and calculated. The judge paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle over the room. You are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. You will also pay restitution to the affected businesses and families, totaling $15 million. Harrington's expression hardened as he was led out of the courtroom by bailiffs. He glanced back once, his icy glare landing on Brandon. But Brandon didn't flinch. Justice had been served. Eric Waller's sentencing came next. His cooperation had been instrumental in dismantling Harrington's empire, and his testimony had directly tied Harrington to the violent tactics used to displace minority communities. However, the court did not overlook his role in orchestrating those same tactics. Mr. Waller, the judge began, while your cooperation has been noted and appreciated, it does not absolve you of your actions. You were a willing participant in a scheme that caused significant harm to innocent people. However, your decision to testify has helped bring the truth to light. After a pause, the judge continued, You are sentenced to 7 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 4 years based on good behavior. Additionally, you will pay restitution of $500,000 to the victims of your crimes." Waller nodded, his face pale but resigned. He had traded his freedom for a shot at redemption, and the weight of his choices was clear on his face as he was escorted from the courtroom. Gary and his crew were next, their violent actions and blatant disregard for the law making their sentences inevitable. Each stood as the judge addressed them. Mr. Gary Campbell, Mr. Todd Andrews, and Mr. Michael Reed, your actions were not only criminal, but cowardly. You targeted vulnerable business owners and communities, believing you could intimidate them into submission. You physically assaulted a man who stood against you and acted without regard for the lives you disrupted. The judge turned his gaze to Gary first. "Mr. Campbell, as the leader of this crew, you bear the greatest responsibility. You are sentenced to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole." Gary's bravado had long since faded, and he stared at the floor as the sentence was handed down. The judge shifted to Todd. "Mr. Andrews, your willingness to participate in these violent acts cannot be overlooked. You are sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. Finally, the judge addressed Mike. "Mr. Reed, while your role was lesser, you were still complicit in these crimes. You are sentenced to 7 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years. All 3 men were led out of the courtroom in silence, their fates sealed. As the courtroom emptied, Brandon stayed behind, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. The fight had been long and brutal, but justice had prevailed. Maria joined him, her expression softer than usual. "You did it," she said. "We did it." Brandon nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty defense table where Harrington had once sat. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who fought back, who didn't let them win." Maria smiled faintly. "And now they have a chance to rebuild." In the weeks that followed, Harrington's properties were seized by the city, and restitution funds began flowing to the affected families and businesses. The community center reopened, its programs expanding with the influx of support. Brandon's store became a symbol of resilience. Neighbors came together to help repair the damage, and the once shattered storefront now stood stronger than ever. One evening, as Brandon stood behind the counter, Maria walked in with a rare smile. "Still standing?" she asked. "Always," Brandon replied, a quiet strength in his voice. The neighborhood had faced its trials, but together they had emerged stronger. And for the first time in years, Brandon felt a sense of peace. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.